Yes, Frito-Lay. So back when barcode scanning cost 5 cents per label to put a barcode on a case a long time ago. But one of the things I learned early in my days at Frito was that the key to operational efficiency is making sure that your physical stuff matches your digital map. When those things get out of sync, bad things happen. Fast forward a few years, still a long time ago, I was implementing a baker cell, doing an integration to automatically do a dispense process for a centralized pharmacy in the late 80s, which was still early days for centralized pharmacies at that point in time. And I needed to have a unit to actually do the testing for the integration. So I called up the supplier. I said, I need a baker cell physical unit so I can tie my computer to it. I want to run the test on the protocol, everything else, make sure it works. And they said, okay, I got two units. I can give you a unit that is a exact replica of what we have. You send it a message to dispense 10 pills. We send you a message back that says we dispense 10 pills. The second unit is a real physical unit, and it dispenses M&Ms. Which one do you want? I said, well, there's no question. I have to have the one with the M&Ms. And so they were like, well, yeah, that's what everybody says, but why? I said, well, I don't care so much if it tells me the right answer. I want to know what happens when it doesn't work right. What happens when I thought there were 100 M&Ms in it, but there were only 98 and it just been short? What happens if it gets jammed? How do I automatically react to that from my system standpoint so that I don't go completely out of balance and disrupt the final product? Okay. So fast forward, I got that. We ran through all the exceptions. Excellent project at Centralized Pharmacy. Fast forward into DSCSA, and we've been talking about exceptions for the last couple of days, and all the reasons for exceptions, all the ways to correct exceptions. The thing that is missing that is key is how do we prevent the exceptions? What do we do to reduce the exceptions? What do we do to find exceptions earlier where it's easier to fix? So that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay. We're not going to go through the big chart of all of the reasons why there are exceptions and the different categories of exceptions and what you need to do to post data and to create a response team to do that. We're going to talk about physical stuff in the warehouse because I'm a warehouse guy. And what happens on the floor dictates where all these exceptions happen and where your efficiency is. So first, it depends on where you are on the supply chain. You may be a manufacturer, a co-packer. You may be in the middle of the chain. You may be a wholesaler. You may be a regional distributor. You may be a 3PL supporting one of those players in the marketplace. Or you may be an end dispenser, be it an e-pharmacy, be it a retail pharmacy, being a hospital network that's doing your own centralized filling, or even directly in the hospital in your various satellite pharmacies. Depending on where you are in that chain dictates what you have to do from a legal standpoint relative to DSCSA and your interactions back and forth with TraceLink. So you need to understand what those are that you need to do on the floor in the warehouse so that you can actually make sure your systems do the proper interaction back and forth with TraceLink and your trading partners. So on the front end of the chain, you're the manufacturer, you're the co-packer or whatever. So you're generating the stuff from the start. Your legal requirement technically only begins at the point where you change ownership and you ship something to somebody. So you have to create and commission the SG10s, you have to create the aggregation events, you have to create the, commission the SSECs, the shipping events, and pass that on down the chain. Technically, you don't have to do that until you actually ship it to somebody. Realistically, it's happening back at the front end on the manufacturing line where you've got the automation to actually apply this and do this automatically so that you don't have any kind of rework downstream. But that's a place where errors can get injected when labels get jammed, etc. Next in the supply chain, the wholesaler, distributor. These guys have to manage the serial number from the inbound door to the outbound door, every place in between, and make sure that they don't create more confusion and more mistakes in the process, understanding that they may get mistakes coming in from the manufacturer, the co-packer, that they may find or they may not find, and they may pass some of those mistakes on down. But they have the responsibility for doing deaggregation events, reaggregation events, shipping events, and commissioning events for SSCCs. They are not allowed to create or define an SG10 back into the repository. That's strictly restricted to the manufacturer co-packer. So systems to make sure that you can't create a serial number, an SG10, into a repository from scratch in that level is critical for your operational systems. The dispenser end seems like it might be a little bit simpler because responsibility really is only at the receiving side. I have to validate against the EPSIS data coming in. I have to make sure that it's all legitimate. I have to make sure that it comes in my building. But once I do that, technically I can ignore all the serial data because I'm not responsible to manage it since I'm not actually selling it to anybody else. I'm actually dispensing it. Reality is it's not quite that simple. Some dispensers are continuing to manage some of that serial data going down the chain through their facility. Adds labor, adds complexity, but they have some business reasons why they think that might be smart. Others are just ignoring it. But there's a third component to it that says, for a hospital network, there are situations that are emergencies. I ran out of inventory. I go down to my local retail store, I buy it off the shelf because we got that agreement. There's no logical EPSIS event happening between those two. It's covered under the exceptions process by the FDA, and you as a dispenser needs to understand what are the allowed exceptions, what are my SOPs to track that, so when the auditor comes in, I can explain why this material showed up on my audit that I don't have a record of actually buying it from my wholesaler. So every place in this supply chain has its own level of complexity, its own business rules that need to be applied. Special case being the 3PLs representing the manufacturer, that is kind of a hybrid between the manufacturer and the distributor. They typically act more like a distributor because they typically get an EPSIS file coming in, do the validation when it comes in the building, even though technically they're only responsible when they ship it out the door. Some of them have their own DSE repositories. Some rely on the manufacturer's repositories. Some have some communication event. Okay? But depending on where you are, that dictates what you have to do. Some things you have to do all the time. Some things you have to do never. And then the complicated part is things that you have to do, it depends. Always, when you're doing receipts on purchase orders, you've got to do the validation. Always, when you're doing shipments, with the exception of the dispenser, you have to create your aggregation events, you have to create your shipping events. Customer returns, you've got some verification processes you have to do before you can bring it back into the building. You need to make sure that you have those things established. Vendor returns, depending on what you're doing, if it's going back for destruction, if it's going back for a recall, if it's going back for some other misshipment reason, it can depend on what the cause is and what the reason you're shipping it back, but it does have impacts as to what you have to end up transmitting back and forth to TraceLink. Never warehouse transfer. So if you're just moving it around your internal network, warehouse to warehouse, but it doesn't change ownership, warehouse to satellite pharmacy, you don't have to deal with it. There's nothing that's required for you to manage other than making sure that from an operational and a transaction accounting standpoint, you know where this stuff is going. But there's no DSCSA requirement to post anything. Same thing with when you're filling scripts. The sometimes piece is where it gets complicated. If I'm doing a cycle count, I might need to post something to the repository. I might not. It might depend on the specific situation. Same thing when I'm doing internal moves. If I move a pallet from one location to another location in the warehouse, I don't need to do anything. If I take 3 cases off of a pallet and move it someplace else, I just did a physical deaggregation event. In order for my map in TraceLink to be matching, I should be posting an unpack event to TraceLink for those 2 cases. If I don't, someplace down the chain, someone is going to have to make an inference and an assumption that I must have done that before, which now is a place I can create some errors. Okay? So depending on where you are, if you're the wholesaler, distributor, 3PL, You've got to obviously do the receiving, the miscellaneous transactions, the shipping transactions. So all of that relies on the inference. So whatever comes in, you're going to infer at the highest level you possibly can so that you're most efficient, recognizing that the lower levels of inference could be subject to errors based off of hidden discrepancies. If you're the pharmacy dispenser, e-pharmacy, whatever, you've got a different model, and this is where it really gets complicated from a WMS standpoint. Very few WMSs in the market today, out of the box, support a multi-level serialization component that you need for DSCSA. Those that do typically will force you to have a serial number at the lowest unit of measure, which is not really the case for DSCSA when I'm managing tablets. There is no serialization there. So you need a WMS or an operational system in the warehouse that can understand where does my serialization start. Second piece is, since I'm only responsible for doing this on receiving and I'm not responsible anyplace else, you're not going to find WMSs in the market in general that support serialization, verification on receiving, and then just ignore it the rest of the way. That's not the way the other industries work, so nobody is building that unless they're building it specifically for the DSCA environment. So where do challenges start to come into play as to mismatches between the physical stuff that I'm so passionate about and the data that's sitting in your repository in TraceLink? Okay. Inbound receiving. There is no technically enforced, defined connection between an ASN and your EPSIS file. Different reasons for that, and we'll talk to that in a second. From a data standpoint, data no product. I don't have anything on my receiving dock to compare this to. I don't know what I didn't receive. All I know is what I physically received. So I can't even tell you without a lot of research, and more so research on your end as my supplier, as to what I'm missing. Flip side, if I'm product and no data, I have something physically on my dock. I'm not technically allowed to own it and dispense it, but since I physically have it, I want to track it. I want to be able to know where I put it in the warehouse because my quarantine cage is full and I'm going to move it someplace else. I don't want to lose it. I don't want to allow anybody to use it, but I want to be able to quickly find it when someone calls me back and says, I got the solution for that exception on that SSEC number ABC. I can quickly go into my system that's using to operate my warehouse, search on that SSEC number in storage, even though it is in quarantine and segregated. Now I can pull it out. Now I can do the right interactions, get it through the process to get updated into TraceLink and make it available. Reverse logistics. There is no EPCS file. How in the world do I aggregate all of this stuff that comes back to me if I don't have any kind of aggregation history? What is the process for me to try to build that? Missing labeling. It came back, but it doesn't have labels on it. Right? I mean, we've seen people that have sent cases back in with a case SG10 with the SG10 quantity, they mark through it and they say there's only 6 in here. Well, that's not an SG10 for the case. They just happen to use that box to send it back. So now I've got to figure that out. Indirect processes, where you shipped it to may not be who ultimately returns it, particularly when you get into returns for recalled products, expired product. It's gone further out in the supply chain before it comes back to you. So you can't just rely on your transactions to your trading partner to try to recap where that inference is. It's going to be someplace else. We talked about the match between ASNs and EPCIS files. There's been some discussion this week relative to the advantage of continuing with ASNs for operational reasons, and I totally agree. The warehouses really depend on this to streamline the receiving processes. The challenge is that there is no standard as to how to map that ASN to the EPCIS file. Some people populate the EPCIS file with the ASN number. Some populate it with the PO number. Some populate it with a BOL number. How does this poor guy on the receiving dock know what to match this up against? If you don't have a system that can direct that operator on the floor, when I'm doing a receipt, how do I determine what two things to link together so that I get my accounting system right and my traceability repository right at the same point in time. Big challenge. That's one that we're still trying to work through. Other things that match the difference between your physical and your digital. Cycle counting. If you lose something in one side of the warehouse, it may exist someplace else because it's just misplaced. How do you report that? You need to report that and take it off of your inventory file so that you know that you don't have it, but you don't want to destroy it because then you can't reuse it. You've got to get it into some kind of state of lost or some virtual location. You may need to post that into TraceLink to say that it's in a different state. So that now when you find it, you can verify the state was lost, change the state back into found, bring it back in with the complete aggregation that already existed. Picking and shipping side, breaking units a measured typical place where we find people finding the hidden discrepancies. So at that point in time, as soon as I break something open, start to scan something at a lower level that I inferred, now's a chance for me to find a mistake before it goes out the door, and it's going to be easier for me to fix. Yeah. One of the things that is an advantage is if within your WMS, if you know the difference between a SG10 that you physically scanned versus inferred, which some WMSs will give that information to you, then you can tell that this was an inferred and you can trace that all the way back. It must be a hidden damage versus something you interjected by scanning the wrong data element. So this gets into where do all those things happen? You know, a lot of people think that it starts at the receiving dock and then I really have to process it at the shipping dock. And I kind of ignore all of the things that happen in between. Well, there are things that happen in between. Deaggregation events, moving things around, status changes. If you're not communicating those real time to TraceLink, you now have a complete mismatch of what's going on in your warehouse from your digital copy of what's in TraceLink. And we're going to talk about how to get around some of that stuff as we go forward. So road to operational compliance. Okay, so we're just trying to survive today to be compliant and hit the current deadlines. Forget efficiency for a minute. We just want to get compliant. So what's the keys to that? From my standpoint, it's understanding, it's system support, and then making sure those two things come together to make sure that your operators are working accurately on the floor. Starts with understanding. What I find is Fred on the floor who's doing picking, he doesn't understand what an SG10 is. He doesn't really care what an SG10 is. All he knows is his supervisor told him that he has to scan this thing, he's got to get it right. But you know why? If you make it real to him, he has a better chance of understanding why it's critical for him to get it right. So what I like to do is I like to use analogies that someone can actually understand on the floor and model this. So example number one, SG10. That's like your credit card. There's only one. Nobody else has that credit card number. Nobody else has authorization to use it. There's reasons why people want to steal it from you. There's reasons why people want to duplicate it and work on your behalf. That's exactly what's happening with SG10s. If someone steals it, if you lose it, you have to report it so that nobody else can use it, and you have to destroy it. That's what happens with this box that's worth $5,000 of medication. If you screw it up, you're going to have somebody destroy $5,000 worth of medications that they can never use just because you did something wrong from a serialization standpoint. SSECs, SG10s also kind of like your lost luggage. Common thing we see is someone goes in the warehouse, they go to pick two cases, they scan two case SG10s, they put the scanner down, they go back, they grab two different cases. I just screwed everything up. I'm going to create a problem now for my downstream partner. I'm going to create another exception that I just induced. Same thing would happen if you go to the luggage carousel at the airport. You're in a rush. You pick up the black bag. It's not your black bag. You didn't check the number. You didn't check the name tag. You just grabbed it. You ran out to the taxi line. You rushed off to your hotel. You went to dinner. You came back to the hotel 11 o'clock at night. You open your suitcase. These are not my clothes. Where are my clothes? I have no idea. Are they at the airport? Did somebody else report it? Did somebody else take my bag not knowing it, and they're in some other city and they haven't even opened it yet? How do I recover from that? That's what happens when you scan one box and you take another box. Don't do it. Now I understand why it's important for me to follow the process that you taught me. Master data is also kind of like your personal profile. It's your email address. It's your social security number. If you fill that out wrong on your account profile, nobody's going to be able to send you an alert that says you have possible fraud on your credit card. Nobody's going to know how to send you an alert that you are late on your payment. You've got to get that right so that all of that communication, all the extra transactions become right. Once you make this personal for someone on the floor who understands it, now I get it, right? Now I get it. Now I can understand why you beat me up because I scanned 2 serial numbers, I picked 2 others. I think about it a little bit more whenever I'm doing my job. Next step is auditing your IT application. So how are your current IT applications integrated? Or are they? Or are you doing dual entry? How is your ERP interacting with TraceLink? How is your WMS interacting with TraceLink? What is your level of DSCSA capability embedded directly in these applications? Or are you relying strictly on TraceLink to do all of the interactions for you with a complete disjoint? Map all of those processes both from this physical world on your systems to physically what's happening on the warehouse floor. So when I move something, what does that look like in my digital world? What does it look like in my WMS? What does it look like in my ERP? What does it look like in TraceLink? Do all of those things line up? Or if they don't line up, how do I ensure the accuracy when I get these things back together? And then it gets into modeling all of the permutations. As with my M&M example, a happy path, it's important, but it's the easiest one. You need to model all of the combination of permutations to figure out how you end up resolving those exceptions on the warehouse floor in your pharmacy before it goes forward. Easiest way to do this that I found is to create some kind of decision tree flow map that says, I have a problem. Question number 1, do you have stuff on the floor but you don't have an electronic map for that? So I've got data with no product. Yes, I go down the fork on that map. I go to my next question. Each one of these questions then can drive me down to the next level of granularity to figure out exactly what my specific use case permutation is. But also each one of those decision blocks, I need some piece of data or some interaction to understand how to make the decision between whether I go left or right. So for each one of those blocks, you can actually map in where do you find the data for this piece, right? If it is a SG10 that you think you shipped to somebody, but they say that it is still in the building, can you go into your system, in essence, do a Google search and say, WMS, tell me who I shipped this SG10 to. It was inferred at a unit level inside a case on some shipment. I don't know what it is. Google, tell me where I shipped that to and when I shipped it to. Or Google, tell me what shelf location, where is it in my warehouse so I can go look at it. I can go grab it and see, yeah, I don't have it, there's something wrong. And then once you have that, the bottom of those boxes is now a resolution process. Another flow chart possibly tells me, how do I untangle this now that I know this scenario that I need to follow? What do I need to do logically? What do I need to do physically? Sometimes this is only a logical transaction set that we need to do possibly between trading partners just to swap their SG10s. Sometimes it's physical. I need to go actually adjust something in my warehouse because I got the wrong thing in my warehouse. Sometimes I need to bring it back from the client. Depending on what I'm doing, I've got to make those determinations. Accuracy is everybody's responsibility. Upstream, you're relying on your supplier to get it right? But you're also internally responsible to make sure that you bring it in and you do the validation. And you're also responsible to make sure you don't induce any more errors into the supply chain based off of your operation. And in the ideal world, the best is to uncover your supplier's errors as soon as you possibly can in your process so that you can fix it earlier. The earlier you find it, the much easier it is to fix it. Downstream, those are the people that need to help you, right? So depending on where you are in the exception process depends on what your role is. So if we look at a typical kind of partner interaction on an exception, I sent you this. This is what I see. I need more information. I'm going to send you a picture. I'm going to take a photo of that box, that SG10, that barcode. This is what I physically have. That is ideal for the supplier because I now know you physically have control of that thing. I don't have to believe that you just typed in the number right and trust you on your email. I physically see proof that you have that. So now I know where the physical stuff is, and now I can start to trace back on the logical side from a trace link, from my WMS, from my ERP to figure out where I think that particular serial number logically went, so I can now start to untangle it. And I can then tell you, this is what I think I sent you because that doesn't match. And you may go back in and do some investigation to see, maybe I just swapped the SSEC labels on the two wrong pallets. That's easy enough for me to fix. But depending on what it is, I'm going to now match it up with my TraceLink repository. So I now know what my physical is. I know what my repository says. I know what the mismatch is. I know my permutation. Now the question is with my trading partner, what do you want to do? Do you want to keep it? Do you want to return it? Do you want to swap it for the right data? Or do I need to inform somebody else because what you received, I think I sent to somebody else and I need to communicate and interact with them? So depending on what it is, it gets to be very complex. So you end up with a matrix that tells you under each of these type scenarios, what are the exact steps that I need to play? And depending on where I am in the supply chain can dictate which one of those things are. Some things are logical, as I said. Some things may involve physical movements as well. Now that we are in some state of compliance, so let's assume, fast forward, we've hit the deadline, we're compliant, we just have a whole bunch of exceptions that we have to deal with, but our operation is actually getting the job done. But it's taking forever because they're doing all of this extra work, all this extra validation, all of those kind of things. So how do we move from just being compliant to becoming efficient? Starts with IT support. Do you have embedded logic in your systems to directly manage exceptions, systematize the investigation, and quick guides in order to fix it? Not going into TraceLink, but locally in your WMS or your ERP with the linkages into TraceLink. That allows you to quickly put those processes closer to the floor where it's going to be faster to resolve. Example, you created a flow chart earlier to say, here's my decision logic. There's no reason why you can't have a menu option on your WMS screen. I click into that and I get my decision tree right there. I find my permutation. I have another menu that says, here's my workflow in order to resolve that particular permutation. I now have my steps. I know exactly what I need to do. I can execute that without having to involve a much wider investigation team. If it's complicated, then I roll it up to my resolution team, my cross-functional team that Christine was talking about. But for the simple things that are going to happen day to day, that have to happen quickly, I now have the ability to do it on the floor. Eliminating double entry, absolutely critical to becoming efficient and reducing errors. If you are doing any kind of double entry, you're receiving into WMS, but you're posting all of your validation exceptions directly in a TraceLink UI or some other UI, and those two are not a single point of entry, you now have a place where you're going to induce new errors into the system that are going to be hard to untangle. And then lastly, from a partner standpoint, as you're looking to the future on your systems, how are you investing in systems that are really focused on helping you be efficient from a DSC standpoint? So do you have a system that is going to automate your we process? Once we're compliant, we're going to see a whole bunch of waivers, exceptions, and exemptions. People are going to start bringing that out. How is your system going to handle that? So if we look at, where do the sources of induced errors come with dual entry? If I receive into WMS and then I do my comparison and my receipt postings into some other UI to update TraceLink, either TraceLink or some other application, I now am entering two different pieces of data and they may not match. I may enter a quantity of 100 with lot A into my WMS, quantity of 90 into TraceLink with lot B. Lot B, 90, that's legitimate, but I received the wrong stuff into my WMS. I'm not necessarily going to know that as I go all the way through the process until I try to scan in my dual entry process in my aggregation and my shipping. I'm then going to do that. I'm going to eventually ship it out the door. I'm going to create an EPCIS file that I think is right. My WMS packing list and my ASN shows a different lot number and a different quantity. I got a complete mismatch that has nothing to do with a data error from DSCSA. It has to do with the fact that I'm dual entering and I'm not entering the same stuff. Semi-integrated, where you're doing some level of scanning of the highest level serial number within WMS, whether it's SSCC, SG10, gets it right up front from a receiving standpoint because we're using the inference, so that's all good. I'm doing that at the back end at my aggregation and my staging shipping location. That's all good. But I've got this place in between where I'm starting to move stuff around the warehouse that TraceLink may not know about. So if I bring an SSCC in, I physically move 5 cases off of it, but I don't post anything to TraceLink. And then I go and scan that SSCC for an outbound shipment. TraceLink still thinks that those other 2 cases are on it. All right, so it's going to send an EPCS file with those 2 extra cases. My WMS is going to send the ASN minus 2 cases. I now just introduced a data no product scenario because of the way I've integrated. If you have a fully validated real-time connection, every time there is an interaction that would have a parallel DSCSA event, if you're doing that in real time, so every time you move 2 cases off of a pallet, you post that unpack event back into TraceLink. Every time you move something around and split something, cycle count something, all those things, as soon as you're doing that, you've got a real-time exact match between your physical and your logical. That's always the key to success and accuracy. That means as you go all the way through, when you get to the final shipping, there's nothing in between that would get these 2 out of sync. So your physical always matches your logical. What this also does is any place in that chain, I can now uncover hidden damage. So when I do an unpack event for these 2 cases, I can immediately shut that process down if those 2 cases show a hidden discrepancy. Before I even get to the aggregation on shipping, I shut it down at cycle counting, I shut it down at picking, I put those 2 aside, I quarantine them, I create my exception, I go through my triage to figure out how to solve it. Meanwhile, picker can go pick something else because something else is legitimate and I can get it out the door and I can satisfy my customer. Where does this get really, really complicated? This is with the we process. Years ago, we were thinking of this as grandfathering as it was trying to introduce this. Now we're thinking this kind of as transitional inventories. Everybody's getting ready. Next year, after the guidelines or deadlines are hit, it's going to be formal we's. Right? So you may have a primary supplier as a health system that is fully compliant and send you EPCIS files. You may have a secondary distributor, smaller distributor, that has a we, that has an exception where they don't have to provide that to you until sometime in the future. Both of those suppliers may send you the exact same item, exact same lot. The manufacturer, fully compliant, it's serialized. You have one distributor that's not. You're not going to have serial data from that guy. How do you manage that? Where that gets complicated is these things start to go through your warehouse in different paces at different times. And in your warehouse, you have serialized and non-serialized inventory in the building under the same item at the same time. All of them have SG10 labels on them. You can't tell by looking at it which one is under a we, which one is not, unless you have systems that can manage that for you, particularly when it gets into receiving or picking. How do I know as a receiver that I don't need to worry about the serial numbers, or I do need to worry about the serial numbers. You need embedded logic within your applications to drive that for you. In the end, what you're going to possibly have, particularly at the end state, is you may get an SSEC that has serialized product with an EPSIS file, non-serialized product under a WE, which requires an ASN with T3. So now you need an ASN with T3 and an EPSIS file, and OTC product that is not subject to anything on the same physical product. How does that receiver know what to do with that pallet if you don't embed that logic directly on the floor and make it easy for that receiving operator? You can't rely on tribal knowledge because there is no tribal knowledge for this stuff. I mean, we're still in the expert mode, right? So you've got to systematize this stuff. That gets you into trading partner collaboration. So in order for all of this to work efficiently, you've got to collaborate with your upstream, downstream partners, sharing your SOPs, sharing your photos, whatever you can do collaboratively to make it easy. Key piece is all of that data interaction that Christine was talking about. Secondly is, how do you actually interact with them, right? How do you make it easy? How do you share your SOPs with them so they understand what you're doing internally so that they can map to that if possible? If you have a major trading partner, like some health systems would have a primary distributor, wholesaler, you can maybe work together and have joint SOPs that's going to handle the majority of your process. Once you get to that point, now I'm starting to get into some efficiency, you're still not done. What happens after this? We're not done with DSCSA once the deadline's set, even if all the We's go away. The next thing coming, NDC number is going to expand. You're going to have a whole nother system process with transitional inventory that's going to go through this same life cycle. You need to make sure that whatever IT systems you're using, particularly if you're integrated, highly dependent on that integration, that those platforms are continuing to evolve with DSCSA, with the regulations and with the proper integrations with TraceLink, so that you don't have to go through a manual process, a manual exception process in the future. You just get those things as they go. So you've got a budget for those kind of things, whether it's drop ships, whether it's shipment reversals, whether it's 340B capabilities that's evolving in the marketplace. You got to build strong networks in order to do this. So internally, cross-functional, with your trading partners, cross-functional, but also with external resources. So what are the solution providers doing for you? How can they work collaboratively with you to make sure that they build for the future? They can get their stuff installed generically so that you don't go through giant customizations and giant upgrades all the time. How can you do that? And then how can you leverage industry experts? Some of the organizations, some of the consultants. How can you create an entire network of expertise so that you can learn and become more efficient, understand the future, and build to that and have the best practice? So all of that together leads you to a path where you can not only become compliant, but you can become efficient, and you can make sure that your physical world matches your logical world. And with that, I know I'm way over time, but if you have any questions, I'll be with Christine. We're going to talk all about exceptions again at booth 10 here in another 30 minutes. Appreciate your time together. I'll be around for a while, so if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to catch me and ask. Thank you very much.